In the early hours of Friday, August 11th, 2017, four college friends packed into two separate cars and left Eugene, Oregon, heading east toward the wilderness. Jesse Reynolds, 22, was the one who booked the trip, a weekend retreat at a lakeside cabin near Crescent Lake. It was meant to be a final goodbye to summer before they all returned to their last year at university. With him were Marcus Lane, Liv Morales, and Danny Wilcox. They'd known each other since freshman orientation, spent holidays together, survived finals together. They were, by all accounts, inseparable. They arrived at the cabin just after 5 p.m. A receipt from a nearby gas station confirmed their last known purchase: snacks, 2 gallons of water, and a disposable camera. That evening, according to text messages sent to friends and family, they cooked dinner, played music, and sat around a fire. There were no signs of tension, no distress. Liv sent her sister a photo of the lake, captioned, "Finally breathing." It would be the last time anyone heard from her. When Monday came and none of them returned, alarms didn't immediately sound. At first, parents assumed the group had extended their trip, but when calls and texts went unanswered through the evening and none of the four showed up for classes or work, panic took hold. By Tuesday morning, 2 families had filed missing persons reports. Deputies from the Klamath County Sheriff's Office were dispatched to the rental cabin. What they found raised more questions than answers. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside, there were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows, nothing stolen. A cast-iron skillet still sat on the stove, its contents half-cooked, long gone cold. A pack of cards was laid out on the table mid-game. 4 phones had been left behind, all charging near the kitchen counter, something investigators would later describe as deeply unusual, given that none of the devices had been used since Friday night. Danny's purse and Liv's glasses were still there, untouched. Jesse's beloved Nikon camera, which he never traveled without, was nowhere to be found. Outside, both cars were still parked in the gravel driveway. One had the back window rolled down halfway. The keys were in the ignition. There was no boat at the dock, no canoe, no paddleboard, nothing to suggest how or why they would have left the cabin at all. Their clothes, hiking gear, and shoes remained neatly stacked in the closets and by the doors. Search teams were deployed within hours. Helicopters scoured the tree lines, and drones buzzed overhead, sweeping the perimeter of the lake. K-9 units ran patterns through the nearby forest. Divers entered the water, first by the boat ramp, then expanding outward with sonar equipment. They found nothing. No oil slick, no broken equipment, not even a floating shoe. The lake itself was deceptively calm. At its surface, Crescent Lake looks like any other Pacific Northwest waterline. Glassy, serene, surrounded by thick pine and sheer cliffs. But below that surface, it's hundreds of feet deep, with sharp drop-offs, hidden trenches, and underwater rock formations that can trap even trained divers. It wasn't long before authorities began to quietly prepare families for what they called an unfortunate reality. One sheriff's deputy described it as likely a case of misadventure, that maybe in the late hours of the night the group had taken out a boat, capsized, and drowned. But the families didn't buy it. Marcus's sister was adamant. He was terrified of deep water. He wouldn't have gone out there at night, not even for a dare. Jesse's mother pointed out the weather records. The lake had been calm that weekend, no storms, no sudden wind, and even if they had capsized, someone would have floated. Something would have washed up. But nothing ever did. Media outlets picked up the story within days, dubbing them the Crescent Four. Theories swirled, from tragic accidents to foul play. A local fisherman claimed he saw flashlights near the far end of the lake just before sunrise that Saturday, but couldn't confirm if it was the group. Police found no evidence at the site, no other vehicles, no surveillance, no tracks. It was as if the four had simply walked off the face of the earth. As days turned to weeks, search efforts began to slow. Officials cited budget and resource constraints. Volunteer divers came and went. Forest trails were combed again and again, each time with dwindling hope. The families held on to what little they had: half-finished meals, unanswered texts, a few blurred photographs. The pain of not knowing grew into something worse than grief. It became silent. But beneath that silence, something remained, something that for 8 long years stayed hidden, cold, rusting, and waiting under the surface. Within 24 hours of the group being reported missing, Crescent Lake became the center of one of the largest rural search operations Klamath County had conducted in over a decade. Over a dozen agencies responded: local deputies, state police, search and rescue volunteers, Forest Service rangers. By midweek, helicopters were circling overhead, canvassing dense forest canopies that swallowed signal and sound. Ground teams, outfitted with GPS trackers and thermal drones, began grid sweeps from the lake's northern shore and moved outward mile by mile. Cadaver dogs were flown in from Bend. They picked up nothing. Divers entered the lake on day 2. It was immediately clear why this body of water had a reputation among locals for taking and not giving back. At the surface, Crescent Lake was quiet, clear enough to see down 20 or 30 feet on a sunny day. But past that, the descent was sudden. The bottom dropped off sharply in places, creating underwater cliffs, narrow ravines, and jagged stone shelves. In the lake's southern section, depth readings hit 290 feet. The water was bitter cold even in August. Visibility dropped to near zero. Dive teams operated by feel. And after 5 days of coordinated effort, they had nothing. No debris, no boat, no life jackets, no trace of 4 young adults who should have left some kind of mark behind. On day 6, a hiker came forward. She told deputies she'd been camping 2 miles from the South Cove trailhead and, sometime between 3 and 4 a.m. on Saturday morning, had seen what looked like headlights moving across the lake, not from the highway, but actually on the water. She thought maybe it was a patrol boat, but there was no official night patrol logged in that area. Her report was taken seriously until the timeline started to crack. The group hadn't been seen or heard from since Friday evening. The cabin timestamp showed the stove was turned off just after 9:12 p.m. Friday night. Phone records showed no activity past 9:30. For them to have still been on the lake at 4 a.m. didn't fit. Investigators looked for another explanation. Maybe it was a different boat. Maybe the lights weren't headlights at all, just a trick of mist and moonlight. Still, they followed up, dragging a 200-yard radius from where the hiker claimed she saw the lights. Nothing surfaced, not even a paddle. With no hard leads, the narrative began to shift. Publicly, officials remained cautious. Privately, they started using words like misadventure and accidental drowning. One theory gained traction. The group had taken an unauthorized boat or canoe onto the lake, maybe after drinking, and capsized. In cold water, it wouldn't take long. Hypothermia could set in within 30 minutes. Panic could pull even the strongest swimmer under. Jesse had grown up near lakes and knew how to handle himself in water, but Danny couldn't swim. Liv had once admitted to friends that deep water gave her panic attacks. If the boat flipped suddenly and in the dark, survival chances would have plummeted. But the families didn't accept that theory, not completely. Marcus's father, Craig Lane, was vocal from the start. His son, he insisted, wouldn't have stepped into a boat that late, not without texting someone, not without telling him. He knew Marcus, he knew Jesse. They were planners. If they went out there, he told a local reporter, someone else convinced them to. Jesse's mother brought up something even more troubling. The cabin was rented through her Airbnb account. The original booking was for 6 people. Jesse had reduced it to 4 2 days before the trip. When asked about it, she said Jesse told her someone dropped out last minute, but she never asked who. And now, that small detail wouldn't go away. Online speculation exploded. Reddit threads, amateur sleuths, conspiracy blogs, everyone had a theory. Some said they stumbled upon a backwoods operation, something they weren't supposed to see. Others blamed forest hermits or a rogue park employee. Some pointed to the fact that the lake bordered a known smuggling corridor that had, in the past, been used for discreet exchanges. None of it could be proven. Most of it was noise. But under all of it was the same aching question. If 4 healthy young people vanished from a lake without a trace, how could that happen without help? By week 3, search operations began winding down. Funding had dried up. Volunteers were exhausted. The lake, dense forest, and remote terrain had beaten them. Crescent Lake was declared an active but cold scene, meaning leads would still be followed, but no new resources would be assigned. For the families, it was a gut punch. Their kids were now part of an unofficial statistic, missing in wilderness, no evidence, no conclusion. Still, the whispers didn't stop. The sheriff's department quietly checked criminal registries within a 50-mile radius. They questioned known offenders, ran checks on cabin staff, rental records, maintenance logs. A ranger who'd been working the area that weekend was briefly suspended after discrepancies in his schedule. Though no charges were filed, nothing stuck. The further they dug, the murkier it got. But the silence around the lake never sat right with those left behind. Too clean, too quiet. And for some of them, the unease only deepened with time, especially once they realized something no one could explain. If the group had taken a boat, if they had drowned, then where was the boat? By the second week of the investigation, search efforts had slowed, but the digital trail was just beginning. Investigators shifted focus from the woods to the web, hoping their online activity might offer some kind of map, a timestamp, a hidden clue, or even a sign of distress that had gone unnoticed. All 4 students were active on social media. Jesse, in particular, had a steady presence. Twitter, Instagram, even an old Tumblr blog with late-night thoughts and black-and-white photos. He liked sharing pieces of his life. But after 9:13 p.m. on Friday, August 11, 2017, all 4 phones went completely silent. Not one call, not one text, not even a background ping to a nearby tower. Investigators would later say it was like the phones had dropped off the grid all at once, simultaneously disconnected, powered down, or intentionally disabled. But it wasn't just the absence of activity that unsettled people. It was what came just before. That Friday night, just under an hour before everything went dark, Jesse posted a tweet. It read, "Some places you don't come back from. No photo, no explanation, just 10 words sent from the cabin's Wi-Fi." His account would remain open for years after, frozen in time, with that message pinned to the top by grieving friends who didn't know what else to do. At the time, it was dismissed as nothing more than moody late-night thoughts. Jesse had a reputation for waxing poetic online. But as the weeks passed and hope faded, the tone of that post began to shift. It no longer sounded like a metaphor. It sounded like a warning. The rest of their digital lives were unremarkable, at least on the surface. Marcus had recently gone through a rough breakup with his girlfriend of 2 years. Texts revealed he was reluctant about the trip. He said he needed space, but wasn't sure a cabin in the woods was the right place to get it. A friend claimed Marcus had messaged him Thursday night saying he felt off about something, though what that was never clarified. The message deleted itself an hour later. His Snapchat account showed a few posts from earlier that day. Photos of trees, a half-eaten burger, a group selfie with Jesse at a gas station. That was the last anyone saw from him. Liv, the quietest of the 4 online, had posted a single photo that same evening. It was a blurry shot of the lake during sunset, the horizon washed in orange, the surface of the water barely visible through mist. Her caption read, "Finally breathing." Her mother said she'd been nervous before leaving. Liv wasn't comfortable around deep water and had expressed some unease about staying somewhere so isolated. She had texted her sister earlier in the week asking if the lake looked weird to you in Google Maps. No one thought much of it at the time. Danny's case was different. Unlike the others, she had withdrawn $400 in cash 2 days before the trip. Investigators found the receipt in her apartment in Eugene. Her roommate said Danny never carried cash, not even for travel. When asked why she might have taken out that much, the roommate hesitated before admitting Danny had recently gotten into an argument with someone over a group project. She never said who. Danny hadn't posted anything from the trip. Her last activity was on Wednesday, a series of TikTok drafts that were never published. She seemed excited, filming herself packing, dancing to a song about road trips. In every clip, she smiled like someone with no idea what was coming. Digital forensics ran location histories on every phone. GPS logs placed them at the cabin by 5:12 p.m. Friday, all 4 connected to Wi-Fi between 6:30 and 9:00. At 9:13, everything stopped. Not a single ping from that moment on. Authorities searched the surrounding cell towers, assuming perhaps a dead zone or a signal failure, but that didn't explain the complete and immediate blackout across all devices. There was no slow drop-off, no dying battery, just silence. All at once. The detail bothered the lead investigator. In most disappearance cases, phones remain active for hours, sometimes even days, especially if they're lost or abandoned. But in this case, it was like someone had taken all four and shut them down with precision. Whether it was the group themselves or someone else, that kind of digital silence rarely happens without intent. As weeks passed, amateur sleuths began building timelines online. Screenshots of their posts, archived text messages, and Reddit threads trying to decode Jesse's tweet were dissected endlessly. Some theorized the group had been lured somewhere. Others thought maybe someone was already at the lake waiting. A few believed Danny's cash had something to do with it. Payment, maybe, or a bribe, or a plan to leave and never come back. None of the theories fit neatly. None could explain why there were no signs of panic, no attempt to call for help, no GPS trail leading away from the cabin or the lake. If they had chosen to vanish, they did so with eerie coordination. And if someone had forced them, they had done it without leaving a trace. But the strangest part remained Jesse's final words. Investigators asked his parents if he might have been referencing a book, a movie quote, or a private joke. They didn't know. No one did. And as the case faded from headlines, that tweet stayed right where he left it, waiting unanswered at the top of his feed. 10 days after the group vanished, the investigation took what seemed like a promising turn. A man named Harvey Ricks, the owner of a small bait-and-tackle shop just 3 miles south of Crescent Lake, contacted the sheriff's office with what he described as critical information. According to Harvey, he'd seen 4 young adults matching the missing students' descriptions late Saturday night. He claimed they were near the lake's public dock, arguing next to a small aluminum rowboat. He remembered the time clearly, he said, because he was closing up shop and walked out to smoke. He described the girl he believed to be Liv as looking shaken, possibly crying. When asked how close he got, he said, maybe 30 feet. He didn't want to get involved at the time, but something about their body language stuck with him. It was the first new lead in over a week. Detectives immediately followed up. They drove out to Harvey's shop, reviewed his security footage, and cross-referenced the timeline with every available digital marker, weather logs, cell tower data, lake patrol reports. But none of it lined up. For one, the students' phones had stopped transmitting over 24 hours earlier. Secondly, the timestamp on Harvey's CCTV showed no one near the dock that night. No foot traffic, no parked cars, no signs of anyone arriving or leaving. And when detectives returned to press him on the inconsistencies, Harvey admitted he had fabricated the entire sighting. Not maliciously, he insisted. He just wanted to help. He felt attached to the story. He wanted to be remembered as the person who had seen something no one else had. And for a brief moment, he was. The damage had already been done. Once news of Harvey's sighting leaked, the internet took off with it. Speculation exploded in all directions. Dozens of new theories emerged, each more dramatic than the last. Some believed the group had been involved in something criminal, a drug run gone wrong, or a party that turned violent. Rumors began circulating about a missing kayak from a nearby ranger station. Others latched onto older, darker folklore tied to the lake. Cult gatherings, missing persons from decades past, whispers about hidden cabins deep in the forest. There was no credible evidence to support any of it, but online forums didn't need facts. They only needed mystery. One Reddit thread gained traction by suggesting the group had orchestrated their own disappearance. It pointed to Jesse's tweet, "Some places you don't come back from," and framed it as a cryptic goodbye. Theorists argued that the students were disillusioned with society and planned to vanish to start a new life off-grid. They referenced Danny's $400 cash withdrawal, Marcus's depression after the breakup, Liv's unease before the trip. To them, it all added up. The theory caught on quickly, mostly because it was the only explanation that gave people a sense of closure, even if it meant assuming the worst. Some even called it a suicide pact. That theory fractured the families. Danny's mother publicly denounced it during a news interview, calling it cruel and baseless, while Jesse's father admitted privately that he'd asked himself the same thing more than once. Marcus's brother was furious. He spent nights responding to strangers online, trying to push back against the narrative. But with no new evidence, the vacuum filled itself. The lack of a body, the lack of a boat, the lack of any single tangible clue, it allowed space for imagination, and imagination rarely showed mercy. The investigators tried to pull the focus back. They doubled down on physical leads, reviewing ranger logs, rental records, and checking surrounding cabins for any sign of overlooked evidence. They canvassed the lake's perimeter again, interviewing every local who had so much as driven past that weekend. One man said he saw a truck parked at the south trailhead with out-of-state plates. Another claimed to hear screams from across the water, though he couldn't say what night. A woman swore she heard an engine late Saturday night, not a car, but something smaller, maybe a boat. None of the stories could be verified, none of them matched. Even among investigators, opinions began to split. Some believed it was a tragic accident, a night swim that went wrong, or a stolen boat that capsized. Others felt something was being missed, a person, a motive, a piece of evidence that had never made it into the report. The longer the case dragged on, the harder it became to separate truth from noise. Leads blurred into rumors. Witnesses contradicted themselves. The original facts, once clear, became buried beneath a growing pile of speculation. In the end, the bait shop confession wasn't the only false lead, but it marked the point where something shifted, where the mystery stopped being about what happened and became about how many different ways people could explain the same silence. And in that silence, something more corrosive began to take root, the fear that the story might never have an ending at all. By the fall of 2017, the investigation had gone quiet. No updates, no new searches, no answers. What remained was a set of grieving families, 4 untouched phone chargers on a kitchen counter, and a remote lake that seemed to swallow both evidence and memory. Crescent Lake had become less a place and more a symbol of what happens when people disappear and nothing is found. By year 2, official resources had dried up completely. The case remained open in name only, filed under active unsolved, which allowed detectives to field occasional tips, but no one was actively working it anymore. One family moved away. Another stopped returning calls from the sheriff's office. There was nothing left to say. Marcus Lane's father refused to let it go. He quit his job in early 2019 and turned his grief into something else: obsession. He launched a YouTube channel titled Vanished at Crescent, where he posted weekly videos detailing his own theories about what had happened. Some were reasonable, others more speculative. He mapped out underwater fault lines, examined sonar anomalies, even published a 3D model of the lake's topography using old geological survey data. One video, titled The Fifth Passenger, asked whether there might have been someone else with the group that weekend, someone who was never reported missing. It didn't go viral. Most videos capped out at a few thousand views. But in the comments, a small community began to form, people who believed the lake was hiding something. Each year on August 11th, a memorial was held at the lake's north shore. Candles, flowers, framed photos staked into the dirt. The first anniversary drew nearly 100 people, classmates, relatives, curious onlookers. But by year 5, the number had dwindled to barely a dozen. Locals began to treat the story like folklore. People whispered about the Crescent Four, especially in the off-season, when the lake was at its most quiet. Some said the area was cursed, that the land beneath the water had a history. There were older stories, of drownings, of boats found adrift, of campers who heard voices near the shore but saw no one. None of it ever made it into official reports, but the silence had started to feel heavier than the facts. Liv's sister moved across the country. Danny's mother stopped talking to the press. Jesse's parents separated in 2021. It was never publicly stated that the disappearance caused it, but it hung over everything, a weight that never let up. For most people, time softens things, but in cases like this, time only deepens the hole. Without answers, there's nothing to heal around, only questions that rot into obsessions. Then, in late 2024, something changed. It had been an unusually dry summer. The Pacific Northwest was facing one of the worst droughts in state history. Snowmelt had been minimal. Temperatures had peaked well above average for 3 straight months. By September, Crescent Lake had receded by nearly 20 vertical feet, the lowest level in recorded history. Boat ramps sat on dry gravel. The lake's eastern shoreline, once submerged, was now a stretch of muddy flats and jagged rock. People began walking out into places that hadn't been accessible in decades. A few snapped photos, shared them online. One post joked that if the missing students were still out there, this would be the year they'd be found. No one was laughing the following week. On October 3rd, a group of amateur divers from a recreational YouTube channel posted a video of themselves exploring the lake's newly exposed southern trench. They weren't looking for evidence. They were filming content, exploring underwater rock formations, testing new sonar. At the end of the video, one diver mentioned something strange. A large, metallic reflection deep in a crevice near the edge of the old drop-off zone. The object was lodged, barely visible through silt and debris. They didn't think much of it at the time. But within days, word spread, and the video caught the attention of someone who did. A retired deputy from Klamath County, who'd worked the original disappearance, flagged it and forwarded it to the state dive team. Within 72 hours, officials were back at Crescent Lake for the first time in nearly a decade. What they were about to find would force the investigation wide open again, and with it, a truth that had been waiting quietly beneath the surface for 8 long years. In April of 2025, Crescent Lake was still lower than it had ever been. The winter hadn't brought enough snow to replenish the reservoir, and by spring the waterline remained 20 feet below normal. Locals were used to fluctuation, but this was different. Entire sections of shoreline that had been submerged for decades were now dry, cracked, and walkable. Curiosity pulled people back. Hikers, fishers, amateur explorers, all retracing the edges of the lake like they were walking on old secrets. But it wasn't until a trio of hobbyist divers from Portland decided to make a weekend out of it that something finally broke through. They weren't professionals. They didn't have law enforcement training or missing persons on their mind. They were just looking to document the lake's new shape for their small YouTube channel, a side project about geology and forgotten places. They had a cheap underwater drone, a few air tanks, and a borrowed sonar rig they didn't quite know how to use. But on the afternoon of April 12th, somewhere along the lake's southeastern trench, one of them spotted something they couldn't explain. Lodged between 2 submerged boulders at an unnatural angle, barely visible through the murk, was a reflective surface. Not rock, not natural, aluminum. They filmed it, posted the video online a few days later. At first, it looked like nothing, a flat silver blur caught between shadows. But in the comments, viewers began asking questions. Some remembered the Crescent Lake case. Others zoomed in, speculating that the object wasn't debris at all, but a man-made vessel. The divers themselves were hesitant to say anything. They didn't want to get involved, but one of them eventually reached out to the Oregon State Police with GPS coordinates and a timestamp. Within 48 hours, a formal dive team was dispatched to confirm what everyone now feared. On April 19, 2025, law enforcement divers reached the location. Using high-resolution sonar, they mapped the submerged trench, scanning the area inch by inch. What they found confirmed the suspicions. A small, aluminum rowboat overturned and partially crushed beneath hundreds of pounds of rock and sediment. It had likely been trapped there since the week of the disappearance. The sides were dented, rusted, the hull pinned between natural stone. But it was unmistakably a boat, the first one ever connected to the Crescent 4. It had no registration number, no serial ID. Inside, wedged beneath one of the warped bench seats, were the first physical traces anyone had seen in 8 years. There were scraps of dark fabric, faded and torn, a cracked phone case, a rusted carabiner with nylon cord still knotted tightly around it. And near the bottom of the hull, sealed beneath debris, was a laminated college ID. It had faded under water exposure, but the photo was intact. The name, smudged but legible, read, Olivia Morales. When that detail was released, everything changed. The Morales family was contacted immediately. Liv's younger sister, now in her 20s, said the ID was real. It matched the one Liv had used during her final year. The sheriff's office issued a press release the next day. The Crescent Lake disappearance was no longer cold. The case was officially reopened. News of the discovery spread fast. Media outlets who hadn't touched the story in years returned to it with fresh urgency. Newscasters recapped the original timeline, re-aired archival footage, and speculated openly about what the boat meant. Had the group capsized? Was this proof of an accident? If so, why had no other evidence ever surfaced? And if not, what else might still be down there? For the families, the discovery was equal parts relief and pain. It proved the group had entered the lake, yes, but it also confirmed something deeper, something harder to face. They hadn't left. They hadn't staged anything. They hadn't vanished into thin air. They were down there the whole time, waiting. Investigators returned to the lake with specialized equipment, this time operating with a clear search zone. Forensic technicians examined the boat inch by inch, collecting trace DNA from fabric samples, studying the damage to the hull, and reviewing water movement patterns that might explain how the vessel ended up trapped so far below the surface. One diver described the trench as a natural funnel, a steep drop-off that could easily pull a light craft downward, especially if it capsized in the right conditions. But there was something odd. No oars were found, no life vests, no flotation gear, just the boat and what remained inside. The unanswered questions returned fast. Who had brought the boat? The group wasn't known to have access to one, and no local rentals had been checked out that weekend. Why were there no text messages or calls indicating they were going out on the water? And most critically, what had caused the boat to go under? The sheriff's office called it a significant breakthrough, but emphasized that it raised just as many questions as it answered. The investigation pivoted to re-interviewing witnesses, double-checking old ranger logs, and examining every theory with a renewed sense of urgency. Because if the boat had been found, if Liv had been found, then the next question was obvious. Where were the others? On May 3, 2025, the aluminum rowboat was pulled from Crescent Lake. It took nearly 6 hours to extract. The process had to be delicate. The boat's hull was fragile, crushed inward in places, with sharp corrosion along the edges. Divers had wrapped it in tarp underwater and secured it with flotation pontoons to prevent further disintegration. Once on shore, forensic teams immediately went to work, cordoning off a section of the boat ramp and setting up a temporary field lab. What they found inside would finally provide answers. Not all of them, but enough to crack open the mystery. Trapped beneath the center bench was a shattered GoPro camera. Its casing had fractured under pressure, but the memory card inside was still intact. It was immediately sent to a digital forensic unit in Salem. Within 48 hours, investigators confirmed the footage was recoverable. The camera had been recording in bursts, short intervals, some accidental, others intentional. The first few clips were ordinary, blurry shots of feet climbing into the boat, laughter, voices passing around a bottle. Then, someone, likely Jesse, flipped the camera to face the lake. The footage showed calm water stretching into blackness, broken only by the distant echo of their own voices. Marcus could be heard joking about steering. Danny laughed. Liv's voice was harder to pick out, but at one point she asked if they were too far out. Jesse responded with something unclear. Then silence. Then water. The last clip ran just under 30 seconds. It was chaotic. The angle jolted sideways. Someone shouted. There was a loud metallic thud, possibly the oar hitting the side of the boat. Liv screamed. Danny called out Jesse's name. Water splashed against the lens. Then Jesse's voice came through, clear but strained. "Get us back to shore, now." The camera tilted upward, showing a blur of dark trees, a flash of someone's hand, then a rush of water pouring over the lens. The footage ended in black. It was the most concrete piece of evidence the case had ever had. It confirmed that all four were in the boat, that the boat was in motion, that something had gone wrong, and gone wrong fast. Investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame, syncing audio spikes with known voice patterns, analyzing water movement, ambient noise, and wind pressure. Nothing in the video suggested a storm, high winds, or mechanical failure. In fact, weather logs for that night confirmed the lake had been calm, windless, with no environmental events reported. No thunder, no sudden shifts, no reason for the boat to have capsized on its own. This is where the investigation took a turn. If the water was calm and the group was experienced enough to stay near the shoreline, what caused the panic? What knocked the boat sideways? And why did Jesse, usually the one who kept everyone grounded, sound truly afraid? The working theory remained an accidental capsize, but it didn't sit well with everyone, especially those who had followed the case for years. Some believed a large underwater obstruction could have caused the boat to tilt. Others floated the idea of a sudden weight shift, someone standing up throwing off the balance. But those theories still couldn't explain the tone in Jesse's voice or the total lack of flotation gear in the boat. Forensic analysis continued. Trace DNA was collected from inside the hull, strands of hair, tiny fibers, a partial fingerprint on the shattered camera mount. Results matched all 4 students. Jesse, Marcus, Liv, and Danny had been there, in that boat, likely the same night they disappeared. It wasn't definitive proof of death, but it was as close as authorities had gotten. Liv's ID had already been found, and now there was confirmation the others had entered the lake with her. What remained unknown was how and why they ended up 190 feet down. Some detectives speculated the group had taken a boat they weren't supposed to. The aluminum rowboat matched the make of a model kept in a storage shed near the ranger station, one that had gone unaccounted for after a fire in 2018 destroyed parts of the rental database. No one had officially reported it missing. It had simply vanished. If the group found it and decided to use it without telling anyone, that could explain why no records existed. But it still left one critical question unanswered. Why take it out after dark? Investigators returned to the GoPro audio again. In one of the earlier clips just before the panic, someone, possibly Marcus, mumbled a sentence that was partially obscured by wind noise. With enhanced audio filtering, forensic technicians pulled one phrase from the garbled speech. It sounded like, "He said we'd be fine." The team isolated it, played it back dozens of times. He said, not she, not we, he. Authorities released no names, no suspects. But behind closed doors, the question changed. It was no longer just what happened on the lake. It became, who else was out there with them? The forensic audio team spent nearly 2 weeks combing through the GoPro footage. With modern enhancement tools, they were able to isolate specific voice prints, filter out ambient distortion, and separate overlapping conversations by tone, pitch, and cadence. What they found startled them. In the final sequence before the chaos, just after Jesse says, "Get us back to shore," and moments before the boat is overtaken by water, a voice can be heard in the background. It's deep, calm, male. A steady tone, unlike the frantic shouting of the others. The words are muffled, but the cadence is measured, too measured, as if whoever was speaking wasn't panicked at all. This voice wasn't immediately familiar. It didn't match Jesse, Marcus, Liv, or Danny. Audio mapping software was used to confirm. 4 of the voice profiles aligned perfectly with the known victims. The 5th did not. It belonged to an adult male, estimated to be in his late 40s or early 50s, with a slight regional accent that leaned rural, possibly Northern Californian, possibly Southern Oregon. It wasn't just background noise. He spoke directly into the chaos. The clearest fragment they recovered came moments before the footage cut to black. It was quiet, almost buried beneath the shouting, but unmistakable. He said, "It's fine. I've done this before." That sentence changed everything. The case, once thought to be a tragic accident, was now under a new classification: possible homicide. Investigators launched a complete re-review of all ranger records, visitor logs, witness interviews, and third-party contacts tied to the Crescent Lake area from August 2017. They pulled every name: cabin owners, local employees, forestry workers, anyone who might have crossed paths with the group during that weekend. Most were ruled out quickly, but one name, buried in an early ranger shift log, stood out, not because it had been fully documented, but because it hadn't. Thomas Brill. Brill was a volunteer ranger assigned to the Crescent Lake District sporadically between 2013 and 2017. He wasn't salaried. He filled in on high-traffic weekends, usually helping with campsite inspections or maintaining perimeter trails. He had a small camper registered in his name, parked on and off at a lot near the southern entrance to the lake. But when investigators searched the official logs for the weekend the students went missing, Brill's name wasn't listed. No hours logged, no shifts claimed. On paper, he wasn't there. But one ranger recalled seeing him that Saturday, briefly near the dock, just a passing wave, nothing more. The tip triggered a deeper background check. Brill had no serious criminal record, but there were incidents, one in 2009 involving aggressive behavior toward a camper, and another in 2015 where he allegedly entered a restricted cabin unannounced. Neither led to charges. He was quiet, polite, kept to himself, the kind of man who didn't draw attention, but the paper trail told a more fragmented story. He'd lived in a series of rental properties, moved around frequently, and had no known family. The last confirmed address on file was a trailer outside of Chemult, just 30 minutes from Crescent Lake. When deputies went to check it, they found the lot abandoned. Inside the trailer was a mess of old tools, survival magazines, and a weathered topographic map of the Crescent Lake area tacked to the wall. Several locations were circled in red. One was the exact stretch of shoreline where the boat had been recovered. Another was the North Dock, where the group was believed to have launched. On a shelf above the map, tucked behind an empty tin, was a small notebook. Most of the pages were blank, but one note, dated just weeks before the group's disappearance, read, "Night rides are better when they don't ask questions." Brill was officially listed as a person of interest on May 15, 2025, but tracking him down proved harder than expected. He hadn't used a bank account since 2019. His last known employment was a seasonal labor job that ended 6 years earlier. He wasn't on social media, no tax filings, no driver's license renewals, and no digital footprint since early 2020. As far as the system was concerned, he had simply dropped off the map, just like the students once had. The revelation shattered what little peace the families had managed to rebuild. For years, they had lived in the purgatory of uncertainty. Now, they were being asked to confront a darker possibility, that someone had been with their children that night, someone who should never have been there. Jesse's father called the discovery both a blessing and a curse. Liv's sister, in a tearful post, wrote, "I spent years imagining them together, alone, but now I wonder who they trusted and why they shouldn't have." Authorities launched a multi-state effort to locate Brill, including coordination with U.S. Marshals. But no credible sightings came in. If he was alive, he was keeping low. And if he wasn't, then the lake might still be holding more than just their secrets. The theory had shifted again, from accident to incident to something more deliberate, and with Brill still missing, one question began to dominate the entire case. Was he ever meant to be on that boat at all? In late May of 2025, two forest rangers conducting routine fire hazard inspections stumbled across an old trailer nestled deep within the Fremont-Weinman National Forest, miles from any marked trailhead. It wasn't on any lease records. There was no driveway, no power hookup, no sign of recent use. It was half sunken into the earth, partially camouflaged by brush and years of neglect. One of the rangers recognized the make and plate style from a bolo issued weeks earlier. Within hours, Klamath County authorities were on site. The trailer belonged to Thomas Brill. When investigators entered, it was clear the space had been abandoned for years, but not without purpose. Inside, they found an overwhelming amount of clutter. Cracked plastic bins filled with rusted tools, moldy sleeping bags, canned food that had expired before 2020. But buried in one corner of the trailer, under a dusty tarp and a collapsed camp table, was a weatherproof lockbox. Inside were folders, dozens of them, each one is carefully labeled with names, dates, and coordinates. There were topographical maps of Crescent Lake, old survey copies with markings and handwritten notes. One map had the words North Dock circled in red ink. Another, folded into thirds, showed underwater trenches with the annotation Deep Shelf scrawled across it. But what disturbed investigators most were the clippings. Newspaper articles from August 2017 and beyond, all centered around the disappearance of the 4 students. Each was underlined, highlighted, or annotated. One had the phrase, "They didn't scream until the water," scribbled in the margin. Several photos had been cut out and taped to the wall behind a sleeping mat. including the widely circulated group photo of Jesse, Marcus, Liv, and Danny from their sophomore year. It had been printed in black and white, then pinned at eye level. In the bottom corner, someone had written the word reckless. There was more. A small plastic milk crate tucked beneath the sink contained a stack of VHS tapes. Most were blank or reused, labeled with old sitcom names or recorded over movies. But one stood out. It was marked with 2 words written in faded Sharpie, Night Boat. It had no date, just those words. Investigators recovered a portable TV from the trailer's back closet, hooked up a battery-powered VCR, and pressed play. What they saw shifted the entire investigation. The tape began with shaky handheld footage, low quality, filmed through foliage, likely with an analog zoom lens. The timestamp in the bottom corner read August 11th, 2017. The same night, the students arrived at Crescent Lake. The camera was angled toward a rustic cabin, half obscured by trees. 4 people could be seen moving around inside, faint shapes through the window, cooking, laughing, unaware they were being watched. The tape continued. Hours later, another clip showed the group outside, standing near a fire pit. Marcus and Jesse were talking. Liv sat on the edge of a log, holding a flashlight. Danny poured something into a red cup. The camera lingered, motionless. It had been set up from a distance, possibly on a tripod. The next clip was closer. The timestamp now reads just past 1 a.m. The group was walking down to the dock. Flashlights flicked across the path. Jesse carried something long, possibly an oar. In the frame's edge, another figure appeared. Taller, older, walking with them. His face wasn't clearly visible, but the outline matched Brill's physical profile. He was wearing a ranger-style jacket, and he wasn't lagging behind. He was with them, as if he belonged. The final clip showed the 5 of them standing near the edge of the dock just before stepping into the boat. There was no audio, just grainy, silent footage that stopped seconds after they disappeared into darkness. The implications were immediate. For years, the question had always been whether the group left willingly, accidentally, or under duress. This footage suggested a 4th possibility, that someone had slowly, methodically inserted himself into their orbit, gained their trust, and led them toward something they didn't fully understand. Law enforcement now believed Brill had been watching the group from the moment they arrived, that he had studied their habits, waited for the right moment, and positioned himself as a figure of authority, a ranger familiar with the lake, offering a spontaneous late-night tour. It explained how they ended up on the water, why were there no calls, why they might have felt safe. The theory grew darker as the timeline was reconstructed. Investigators now suspected that Brill had coerced or manipulated the group into the boat, possibly even under threat, though no weapon was ever found. The phrase heard on the GoPro, "I've done this before," suddenly felt less cryptic. More practice. If this wasn't spontaneous, if Brill had planned it, then it raised a new and terrifying question. Had he done it before? Despite the breakthrough, one problem remained. Brill was still missing. No verified sighting, no confirmed death, nothing that tied him physically to the lake in the moments after the footage ended. The trailer, for all its weight, was a shell, filled with echoes, not proof. But it left no doubt in the minds of investigators. Brill hadn't just crossed paths with the students, he had stalked them, filmed them, walked them to the dock himself. And that meant the final pieces of the truth, the ones still missing beneath the surface, might hold more than just the story of what happened. They might show how far he was willing to go to make sure no one ever walked away from that boat. On July 17, 2025, exactly 2 months after the discovery of the boat, dive teams returned to Crescent Lake. The goal was clear: search deeper, wider, beyond the trench where the aluminum rowboat had been recovered. It was the only remaining area that hadn't been fully explored, a jagged slope of fractured stone that fell sharply to nearly 220 feet. The lake's drought conditions had receded just enough to allow access. Visibility was still poor. The terrain was dangerous, but investigators believed if there were any answers left to find, they would be at the bottom of that slope. By the end of the second day, they found them. 30 feet below the original recovery site, wedged between 2 massive stone outcrops, divers located a partial human skeleton. It had been compressed by sediment, protected in part by the surrounding rock. Nearby, separated by only a few meters, were more fragments, vertebrae, ribs, and a jawbone. DNA tests confirmed what the families had feared but already known. The remains belonged to Jesse Reynolds and Danny Wilcox. A third set of bone fragments was later identified as belonging to Marcus Lane. Lee's body was never fully recovered, though investigators believe she was among the first to be pulled under and likely drifted further into the trench before settling beyond reach. Small personal items found nearby, a watch, a sneaker, a ring, matched what the students were last seen wearing. Autopsies, conducted through forensic reconstruction and microfracture analysis, revealed key differences between the victims. Jesse and Danny had both suffered blunt force trauma to the head and neck, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or colliding with the boat's structure during a fall. Marcus and Liv showed no such trauma. Their deaths were ruled as drowning, sudden, likely within minutes of entering the water. The pathology was clear. Not all of them went under the same way. Something had happened before the boat capsized. Investigators reanalyzed the GoPro footage again, this time alongside the physical injuries. The sharp pivot of the camera, the panic in Jesse's voice, the muffled scuffling beneath the shouting, it all lined up. Authorities now believe that Jesse and Danny were struck either during an attempted escape or in the initial moments of chaos. The force of the blow, or possibly a struggle within the boat, triggered a violent shift. The boat, already overloaded and unstable, flipped rapidly. There were no life vests, no flotation devices. No chance to recover. Thomas Brill's remains were never found, but investigators believe he died that night as well. Given the water depth, temperature, and the boat's trajectory, the theory is that he either fell in during the struggle or attempted to flee once the vessel capsized. The lack of flotation gear and the shock of cold water would have made survival almost impossible. His last confirmed sighting, captured on the VHS tape, showed him stepping onto the dock with the group. From that moment forward, every person in that boat vanished, until now. The final theory, as released by the Klamath County Sheriff's Office, painted a grim but complete picture. Brill, under the guise of being a volunteer ranger, likely approached the group at some point during their stay. He may have offered them a spontaneous night ride, a tour of the lake, or even just a quiet moment away from the cabin. There's no indication he brandished a weapon or made overt threats. The group may have trusted him, or at least felt no reason not to. But once out on the water, something shifted. Witness reports of his behavior in prior years suggested instability, erratic tendencies. If Brill began to behave unpredictably, possibly aggressive, the group may have panicked. A confrontation ensued, a strike, the boat flipped, and within minutes, all 5 were gone. The families were notified privately before the press. There were no dramatic press conferences, just long phone calls, tears, and the dull relief that comes when the worst thing you can imagine is finally confirmed. After 8 years, the waiting was over. Jesse's mother said she hadn't slept through a night since 2017. Marcus's father posted a final video to his YouTube channel, thanking those who kept searching when officials no longer could. Liv's sister returned to Crescent Lake in early August to see the site herself. She stood at the shoreline for hours, said nothing, then left a folded letter in the sand. On August 11, 2025, exactly 8 years to the day since the 4 friends vanished, a memorial was placed at the lake's edge. A stone marker, carved simply, without names. Just a single line. For the 4 who vanished, and the secrets that couldn't stay buried.